Boston, 1773, was a city teetering on the brink. Its narrow cobblestone streets, crowded with horse-drawn carts and market stalls, buzzed with a tension that no fog could obscure. The harbor, usually alive with the rhythmic clatter of ship masts and the cries of sailors, now seemed quieter, as if the Atlantic itself had sensed the unrest. The British Crown's latest imposition, the Tea Act, had sent ripples of anger through the colony. Merchants fretted over profits lost to monopoly and taxation, while ordinary citizens whispered about taxation without representation in the dim corners of taverns and back alleys. Samuel Adams, a figure both revered and feared, moved through this city like a shadow. His presence was quiet but magnetic, a man whose words could ignite both hope and fury. In a small, smoky tavern near the north end, he leaned over a wooden table, maps of the harbor spread beneath the flickering light of a candle. Around him sat men who, like him, had watched Boston struggle under a growing weight of British rule. The clink of mugs and the murmur of patrons created a hushed symphony of discontent. Each conversation, Adams knew, was a potential spark waiting to set the city ablaze. On the streets, mothers pulled their children close, whispering caution as soldiers in red coats patrolled with a measured authority. Shopkeepers glanced nervously at passing British officers, aware that a single misstep, an unsanctioned word or wrong look, could bring trouble. Every whispered complaint, every secret note slipped under a door was a tiny rebellion. Boston felt alive with it, yet fragile, like a candle flame in a stiff breeze. The docks, usually a place of commerce and chatter, were now shadowed by suspicion. Crates of tea, brandishing the East India Company seal, lined the wharves. To the British, these were mere shipments, goods to be taxed and sold. To the colonists, they were symbols of oppression. Every box represented a principle betrayed, a freedom stolen. Young men, some barely more than boys, lingered at the water's edge, staring at the ships with clenched fists in silent fury. Their faces reflected more than anger. They carried fear, uncertainty, and a burning desire to act. Samuel Adams moved among them, speaking in low, persuasive tones. "The Crown thinks we will bend. They think we are weak, but we are Boston. We are not afraid," he murmured to a group of merchants and laborers huddled against the cold. He spoke of liberty, of justice, and of a future where Bostonians would no longer bow to laws made across an ocean. His words carried weight not because they threatened violence, but because they awakened belief. The citizens of Boston felt seen, heard, and most importantly, empowered. Even in the markets, the tension was palpable. Fishmongers traded quietly, their eyes darting toward the British soldiers stationed nearby. Women haggled over prices, their voices tinged with frustration not only at rising costs, but at the injustice that made their lives harder. Children ran through narrow alleys, playing as if unaware of the storm gathering above them, their laughter a fragile reminder of innocence amid unrest. Every corner of Boston seemed alive with murmurs of rebellion. Every glance, every whispered word carried the unspoken question, how far are we willing to go to defend our freedom? Rumors traveled faster than the merchants' carts. Tavern walls carried messages scrawled in chalk, notes exchanged hands in the dead of night. Some whispered of protests, others of more daring actions yet unspoken, but all agreed on one thing: Boston could no longer endure the heavy hand of British authority. The Tea Act was the final straw, a blatant favor to the East India Company and a slap in the face of every hard-working colonist. The anger simmered, sometimes spilling into heated debates that could almost become brawls. But even in moments of near violence, there was a sense of unity. People disagreed over method, but not over purpose. At the same time, British officials attempted to maintain order. They walked the streets with stiff backs, red coats glinting in the weak sunlight, confident in their authority. Some offered friendly smiles, others barked commands, yet the city seemed to push back invisibly. The citizens' resentment was a quiet force, almost palpable, brushing against the soldiers as they patrolled. Officers began to sense it, even if they could not name it. Boston was a city on edge, and every step could ignite chaos. Nightfall brought little relief. Lanterns flickered along the harbor, casting elongated shadows over the water and the rows of tea-laden ships. The smell of salt and wood smoke mingled in the crisp air. Groups of men huddled near the wharves, discussing plans in hushed tones, while others leaned from windows to catch fragments of conversations. Every move, every glance was charged with anticipation. It was as though the entire city collectively held its breath, waiting for the first spark to ignite a revolution that would echo through history. Amid the uncertainty, Samuel Adams continued his quiet work. He wrote letters by candlelight, spoke in taverns, and encouraged leaders across the colony to prepare for a coordinated response. His speeches, always measured, always passionate, reached the ears of every citizen willing to listen. He framed the unrest not as chaos, but as principle, an assertion that liberty was worth action and perhaps sacrifice. Boston was alive with a dangerous beauty that December, streets filled with whispered conspiracies, the harbor glinting with the reflection of lantern water, and the ever-present shadow of authority pressing down on the people. It was a city of ordinary citizens, fishermen, merchants, women, and children who were beginning to understand that their choices could shape the destiny of a nation. And as the night deepened, one thought hung over Boston like the cold fog rolling off the harbor. Change was coming, and it would not be gentle. By the end of that day, the city stood at a precipice. The ordinary acts of resistance, the murmured conversations, the secret meetings, the careful observation of British patrols were all signs of a people ready to act. Samuel Adams and the Sons of Liberty had stirred more than anger. They had sparked hope, courage, and determination. Boston was poised to become the birthplace of a revolution, and in the quiet tension of its streets, the first embers of defiance grew brighter than the flickering tavern candles. The streets of Boston grew quieter as winter tightened its grip. Lanterns flickered along cobblestones, casting long, wavering shadows that seemed to breathe with the city's unrest. While the ordinary citizens worried about taxes and rising prices, a hidden network of patriots prepared to take action. Samuel Adams and the Sons of Liberty moved with precision, orchestrating plans in secret that would shake the foundations of the British Empire. Inside a dimly lit tavern on the North End, the air smelled of smoke and spilled ale. Maps were spread across a battered oak table, their edges curling from years of use. Candles burned low, illuminating the determined faces of men who knew the consequences of failure. The slightest slip, the wrong word to the wrong person, could mean imprisonment or worse. Yet here they sat, leaning close to share whispers that could ignite a revolution. "Tonight we prepare, tomorrow we act," Samuel Adams murmured, his eyes sharp beneath the flickering light. His words carried a quiet authority. No one questioned him. Every syllable reminded them why they were risking everything, not for wealth, not for fame, but for freedom. The British crown had grown overconfident, believing their soldiers and taxes could subdue a colony that had tasted the idea of self-determination. The men debated tactics. How would they board the ships without being noticed? How could they destroy the tea without revealing their identities? Their solution? Disguise themselves as Mohawk Indians. The masks and feathers were more than mere costume. They symbolized rebellion against British authority and allowed the men to act under a veil of anonymity. No one would know their names, yet every chest of tea dumped into the harbor would carry their defiance. Outside, the city seemed oblivious to the planning in motion. Fishermen mended nets by the harbor, merchants closed shops for the night, and soldiers walked their rounds, unaware that a storm was gathering beneath their noses. The harbor, lined with the Dartmouth, Eleanor, and Beaver, was quiet, too quiet. The ships bobbed gently, crates of tea stacked like silent sentinels, unaware of the men watching from the shadows. Inside the tavern, the plan became more precise. Routes were drawn, signals assigned, and contingency plans discussed. They had studied the harbor for weeks, noting the timing of sentries and the patterns of patrolling soldiers. Every movement, every decision was deliberate. Even the men themselves understood the stakes. Capture would mean not just punishment, but the possibility of setting back the entire cause of liberty. The conversation shifted to morale. "We must make them see we act not from malice, but from principle," Adams said, leaning over the table. "The Crown must understand that Boston does not bend to injustice. Liberty is not a favor, it is our right." His words were more than rhetoric, they were a call to courage. The men around him nodded, feeling the weight and truth of every syllable. They were not merely rebels, they were the bearers of a message that would echo across the colonies. As the night deepened, preparations became physical. Feathers and moccasin-like shoes were gathered for disguises. Ropes were checked, tools prepared for breaking open crates, and barrels of tea were inspected for weight and placement. Every detail mattered. One misstep could reveal them, and the consequences would be severe. Even as they worked, fear lingered in the air like a cold draft. Some men exchanged nervous glances, others muttered prayers under their breath, yet beneath the fear burned determination. Every chest of tea would be a statement, a symbol of the courage to act against tyranny. The citizens of Boston, though unaware of the precise plan, felt the tension in the city. Whispers in alleys, strange gatherings in taverns, and sudden absences of certain men sparked curiosity and rumor. Mothers scolded their children for lingering near the docks, and soldiers muttered about unusual activity near the wharves. Even those who didn't know the details sensed a change, a shift in the air, as if Boston itself held its breath. Meanwhile, Samuel Adams ensured the plan was not only precise, but morally justified. Letters were sent to sympathetic leaders in other towns describing the injustice of the Tea Act and framing the planned action as an assertion of rights, not mere vandalism. He wanted the colonies to understand that this was not chaos, it was measured, symbolic, and necessary. He emphasized restraint and unity, knowing that the narrative of their actions could shape public perception for years to come. Outside the tavern, the night deepened. Snow began to fall lightly, dusting rooftops and the edges of the harbor with a fragile white veil. The world seemed quieter, waiting. The ships loomed in the water, stacked high with tea crates, silent and unaware of the approaching storm. Men moved like shadows, disappearing into the darkness, returning to secret meetings and double-checking routes. Every step was rehearsed, every gesture calculated. The harbor was a chessboard, and the patriots knew that every piece mattered. By midnight, the disguises were ready, the signals assigned, and the men knew what to expect. Some were jittery, pacing in corners, while others silently reviewed the plan in their heads. Samuel Adams stood at the center of the group, surveying the room. His calm presence steadied the others. "History will remember this night," he said quietly, almost to himself. "We may not live to see its full effect, but our children will. Tonight, we make a stand." The hours ticked slowly, each minute a heartbeat in the city's suspense. Outside, the harbor reflected the pale moonlight on the calm water. The Dartmouth, Eleanor, and Beaver rested peacefully, unaware of a group of ordinary men and merchants would soon challenge the authority of an empire. Boston was alive with anticipation, a city of quiet heroes and unseen courage. In the shadows, the Sons of Liberty prepared to leave the tavern, moving silently toward the harbor. Their hearts pounded in unison with the rhythm of the city. Tonight was the night they would transform whispered anger into action, principle into spectacle. It was a night that would forever alter Boston, the colonies, and the very course of history. The chill of winter was nothing compared to the fire of resolve burning within them. As they disappeared into the night, Samuel Adams cast one last glance at the city. He knew the risks, understood the dangers, yet felt a strange calm. Boston was ready, the people were ready, and soon the harbor would bear witness to the first bold strike against tyranny, a strike that would echo through generations. The harbor was cloaked in darkness, the December night cold enough to bite through even the thickest coats. Fog rolled off the waters of Boston Harbor, swirling in ghostly wisps around the masts of the Dartmouth, Eleanor, and Beaver. The ships rocked gently with the tide, each crate of tea stacked like a silent sentinel. The city seemed asleep, unaware that history was about to unfold just beyond its eyes. From the shadows, figures moved with careful precision. The Sons of Liberty, disguised as Mohawk Indians, crept toward the wharves, their footsteps muffled against the wooden planks. Feathers, paint, and makeshift garments hid their faces, and the men carried small tools, hammers, wedges, and knives to break open the chests. Their hearts pounded not from exertion, but from anticipation. Some glanced nervously at one another, others stared ahead, faces set with grim determination. The night air was thick with the scent of salt, wood, and anticipation. Samuel Adams had not joined the boarding himself. His role was to coordinate and ensure the city watched in silence, undetected. Still, he lingered near the tavern, eyes scanning the harbor, a quiet tension pressing against his chest. Every creak of a ship, every flap of a sail in the wind made his pulse quicken. He knew the risk. Capture would mean ruin, possibly death. But the men in the shadows were willing to face it for a greater cause, liberty. The first figures reached the Dartmouth. They paused, listening to the gentle lapping of water against the hull, the distant barking of a guard dog on shore. Then, almost as if rehearsed, they leapt onto the deck, landing silently. Their footsteps were careful, deliberate. The first crate was pried open, and the rich aroma of tea filled the night air, mingling with the sharp scent of paint and smoke from their disguises. The sound of splintering wood seemed impossibly loud in the stillness. One man hesitated. His hand hovered over the crate, the weight of the act pressing down on him. Another placed a firm hand on his shoulder. "It's for freedom," he whispered, "for Boston." That was all the reassurance he needed. Together they worked with precision, breaking open chest after chest, heaving bundles of tea into the icy harbor. Each splash was a thunderous declaration, an audible challenge to the crown that their rule would no longer be unquestioned. The harbor was soon alive with motion. The Dartmouth's deck echoed with the shouts and movements of the men, while the Eleanor and Beaver saw the same determined chaos. Sparks of excitement ran through the participants. Fear coexisted with exhilaration. Some men stumbled, nearly falling into the water, while others encouraged them, reminding them of the larger purpose. Every splash of tea hitting the black water seemed to signal both defiance and unity. Onlookers on shore watched from hidden vantage points. Some were fellow patriots, cheering silently, hearts racing. Others were ordinary citizens, caught between awe and anxiety, uncertain of what to do. The night was thick with tension, and the fog seemed almost sentient, wrapping the scene in a shroud that made the drama more intense. From a distance, it looked like a dance of shadows against the faint moonlight, choreographed by courage and desperation alike. Despite the chaos, the men worked with meticulous care. They knew the symbolic power of what they were doing. This was not random destruction. It was an act of protest that would be remembered for generations. Each chest of tea destroyed was a statement. The colonies would no longer accept injustice silently. It was a calculated strike against authority, a declaration that ordinary men and women could challenge power and emerge victorious, if only in principle. The cold seeped into their bones, the wooden decks slippery beneath their boots. Their hands ached from lifting and breaking, and sweat ran down faces painted in disguise. Yet no one faltered. Each splash of tea into the harbor was met with renewed determination. The night seemed endless, yet the men pressed on, driven by purpose and the knowledge that Boston itself watched with bated breath. A sudden sound, a guard clearing his throat nearby, sent a ripple of tension through the group. For a moment, silence hung over the harbor. Hearts pounded, breaths caught in throats. But the guard moved on, oblivious to the unfolding protest. Relief washed over them, only to be replaced with renewed urgency. There was no time to waste. Every second mattered. Every chest destroyed was a victory. As the final crates were tipped into the dark waters, a sense of accomplishment mingled with exhaustion. The harbor, once orderly and silent, now reflected the chaos above, the splintered wood, the floating remnants of tea, and the ghostly figures retreating into the fog. The men slipped back onto the docks, shadows melting into the night as if they had never been there. Their mission was complete, yet the significance of what they had done was only beginning to dawn on them. By the time the first hints of dawn crept over Boston, the harbor was transformed. Tea floated in the water, crates splintered and empty, a vivid testament to defiance. Citizens, stirring awake, would soon learn of the audacity that had taken place under their very eyes. And from across the city, Samuel Adams watched from the shadows, a quiet satisfaction in his gaze. The act had been risky, daring, and dangerous, but it had sent a message that could not be ignored. The Boston Tea Party was not merely an act of destruction, it was a declaration of principle. Ordinary men, disguised as Mohawk Indians, had challenged an empire and won a moral victory. Their courage would ripple through the colonies, inspiring debates, speeches, and eventually open rebellion. It was a moment that transformed Boston from a city simmering with anger into a symbol of resistance, a beacon for the struggle that would become the American Revolution. As the harbor slowly emptied of shadows, the city itself seemed to hold its breath. History had been made that night, and every splash of tea, every broken chest, and every whispered cheer would echo for generations. For the Patriots, it was a triumph of unity and courage. For the British, it was a bold provocation that demanded a response. Boston, once a quiet colonial port, had become the epicenter of a movement that would change the world. The morning after the Boston Tea Party, the harbor looked like a battlefield. Fragments of broken crates floated atop the icy water, dark tea staining the surface like spilled ink. The Dartmouth, Eleanor, and Beaver lay empty and silent, bearing the scars of a daring protest. Fog drifted across the harbor, shrouding the evidence in a pale, ethereal light. Ordinary Bostonians emerged from their homes, rubbing sleep from their eyes, and were met with a sight that startled and astonished them. The act of defiance was no longer a secret. It was a spectacle impossible to ignore. Whispers quickly turned to murmurs, murmurs to shouts. Citizens gathered along the wharves, some cheering the patriots' courage, others murmuring fears of British retribution. Children peered through windows, trying to understand why their fathers, brothers, and neighbors had risked so much in the dead of night. Mothers clutched their skirts and whispered prayers for safety. The air was thick with a mix of awe, excitement, and apprehension. Boston was buzzing with energy, but beneath the celebration lurked an uneasy awareness. The British response would be swift and severe. News of the audacious protest traveled faster than the morning mist. Riders carried word to nearby towns and cities, and soon pamphlets describing the event circulated throughout the colonies. Samuel Adams had ensured that the action was framed not as wanton vandalism, but as a deliberate, principled protest against unjust taxation. By midday, newspapers and letters conveyed the story with a sense of drama and purpose. Ordinary men, disguised as Mohawk Indians, had taken a stand against tyranny. Across the colonies, patriot leaders hailed the action, using it to galvanize support for a larger movement. Meanwhile, in Boston, British officials were stunned and enraged. Governor Thomas Hutchinson paced in his office, raking a hand through his hair as he stared at reports of the destruction. The East India Company demanded restitution, and the Crown demanded action. Soldiers were ordered to secure the harbor, officers questioned witnesses, and spies scoured the city for clues. Yet despite their efforts, the perpetrators remained hidden. The disguises had worked perfectly. No one knew the identities of the men who had struck such a daring blow. For a moment, even the powerful felt powerless. The British response, however, was inevitable. Parliament passed a series of harsh measures, the Coercive Acts, which the colonists would soon call the Intolerable Acts. These laws closed the Boston port, restricted town meetings, and strengthened royal authority. The city braced for the economic and political consequences, while patriots used these acts as proof that their cause was just. Far from cowing the colonists, the Intolerable Acts fueled anger, reinforcing the belief that British authority was not only unjust, but oppressive. The Tea Party had ignited a fire that now spread to every corner of the colonies. Committees of correspondence were formed in towns and cities beyond Boston, connecting patriots who shared a vision of resistance. Militias began training with renewed urgency, preparing for the possibility of open conflict. Samuel Adams and other leaders leveraged the momentum of the Tea Party, speaking in taverns, writing letters, and coordinating with sympathetic colonists to create a network of communication and solidarity. The event became a rallying point, a shared story of courage that reminded people across the colonies that ordinary citizens could challenge power. For Boston itself, life continued under the shadow of both pride and fear. Merchants worried about lost income as the port faced restrictions, families fretted over soldiers patrolling their streets, and rumors of spies and informants circulated. Yet beneath the anxiety was a swelling sense of purpose. Citizens reflected on their role in history, realizing that their actions, however small individually, were part of something far greater. Ordinary men had become symbols of defiance. Ordinary citizens had witnessed the birth of collective resistance. The Boston Tea Party was studied, celebrated, and debated. Political pamphlets dissected the act, emphasizing its symbolism and moral weight. It was more than a protest, it was an assertion of identity and principle. The men who had boarded the ships had transformed themselves into icons of courage, while Boston itself became a beacon of resistance. Even ordinary workers, previously cautious and fearful, felt empowered to speak, to organize, and to act. The harbor was more than a body of water now. It was a stage upon which the story of liberty had been performed. Across the colonies, the ripples of the Tea Party were felt in taverns, town halls, and homes. Meetings were held to discuss collective action, resistance to British laws, and the rights of citizens. People who had previously seen themselves as isolated in their grievances began to understand the power of unity. The act had shown them that courage, when combined with strategy and solidarity, could challenge an empire. Ordinary men and women recognized that they were participants in a story larger than themselves, a story that would shape the future of a nation. As weeks turned to months, the Boston Tea Party became a symbol, immortalized in stories, speeches, and eventually history books. It was recounted as an act of bravery and principle, a defining moment in the journey towards independence. The event proved that resistance could be both bold and deliberate, and that ordinary people, acting together, could force even the most powerful authority to take notice. For Samuel Adams and the Sons of Liberty, the action was a success, but it was only the beginning. They had demonstrated the power of coordinated resistance, but the path ahead was uncertain. Tensions continued to escalate, and every decision, every assembly, every act of defiance carried the weight of potential conflict. Boston had taken the first step, but the colonies would soon be faced with decisions that would determine whether that step would lead to freedom or further oppression. The harbor, once a quiet and orderly space, now held a legacy. Floating remnants of tea, splintered wood, and the memory of daring men symbolized defiance that no law could erase. Citizens walked past the wharves with renewed pride, knowing that history had been made in their city. Conversations in taverns shifted from fear to possibility, from frustration to action. The Boston Tea Party had transformed the mood of the colonies, setting in motion a series of events that would culminate in revolution. And as Boston settled into a tense calm, the message of that night carried far beyond the city limits. It was a story of ordinary people achieving the extraordinary, of courage overcoming fear, and of principle standing above power. The Boston Tea Party was no longer simply an act of protest. It was a declaration that would echo for generations, a spark that lit the fire of the American Revolution.